Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti.
Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. In continuation of our dive into Renaissance Rome, we're now turning to undoubtedly one of the most important commissions and one of the most important patrons of the late Quattrocento, Pope Sixtus IV, and the first phase of the decoration of his Sistine Chapel. As you may or may not know, the Sistine Chapel is named after its first builder and patron, Pope Sixtus. So please do not call it the Sixtine Chapel, this monstrosity I hear spoken out loud far too often. It is the Sistine Chapel, the chapel of Pope Sixtus. To be clear, this first phase of the decoration of the chapel that we are discussing today is not the high Renaissance artworks of Michelangelo, which comes a few decades later, but the phase of decoration that took place properly during the papacy of Sixtus IV, upon which all of the greatest artists from Florence and central Italy arrived in Rome to paint scenes on the middle register of the walls of the Sistine Chapel. That is, Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, Luca Signorelli, Cosimo Roselli, Pietro Perugino, and some others. Before we look at their paintings, some in more detail than others, I first want us to explore the man, Pope Sixtus himself. His name before he became Pope is Francesco della Rovere, the Rovere family being quite remarkable in the history of the Italian Renaissance. And he was born in 1414 and he lives until the year 1484. Sixtus had a deep university education and he was an ordained Franciscan. As a young man in the Franciscan context, Francesco came under the mentorship of Cardinal Basilios Bessarion, that important patron that we discussed in the last episode, which helped him rise in the ranks of the church, gain some notoriety in Rome and in the Roman social milieu. So he then became a cardinal in 1467 and was ultimately elected pope in 1471 until his death in 1484. So we're in his papacy, that 1471 to 84 range. Pope Sixtus had strained relationships with Florence, especially the Medici, especially Lorenzo the Magnificent. Sixtus had given his blessing to the conspirators of the 1478 Pazzi conspiracy that was designed to kill Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano de' Medici so that the papacy could pacify Florence. Giuliano was killed in the Duomo of Florence, but Lorenzo escaped and eventually routed the conspirators and regained control of Florence. So he had some good reason to believe that this was done with Sixtus's blessing, and so there is an even further strain between Florence and the papacy. But Sixtus IV, once elected pope, almost immediately began his building program to continue the expansion of the Vatican Palace. Often overlooked is the importance of the architecture of the Sistine Chapel itself, which was commissioned and built by Sixtus beginning around 1475 by two Florence-born architects, Baccio Pontelli and Giovannino de' Dolci. Sixtus decided to enlarge and expand the previous chapel on the site of the Pope with a new space in a modern Renaissance style. Of radical importance in this design is that Sixtus specifically wanted this chapel to be built in the dimensions of the Temple of Solomon, that famous temple in Jerusalem, which was long ago destroyed at this point. The Bible indeed gives these specific measurements of Solomon's temple, which Sixtus specifically ensured his new chapel replicated. Thus, what he is doing is asserting his claim that Rome and the Vatican could serve as the new Jerusalem. the new center of Christianity, and the most important pilgrimage site in the Christian world would be Rome, since at that point the city of Jerusalem was under the Mamluk Sultanate and Islamic dynasty. I will say that often Italian relationships with the Mamluks were not always terrible, especially with Mediterranean trade. However, no Christian power controlled Jerusalem, and for that, Sixtus sought to bring forth a new Jerusalem, since the reality of another successful crusade in the Eastern Mediterranean was unlikely. Now, functionally, the Sistine Chapel was a place where Mass could be held, where cardinals would meet, and it is the primary location of the papal conclaves still even today. So, with the new Temple of Solomon built in Rome, not as a Jewish temple, but as a Christian chapel in the heart of the Vatican, the next step was to paint the interior. Now, looking back, although it was somewhat clear that Sixtus was at least complacent in the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, Lorenzo de' Medici would still use one of his favorite diplomatic techniques to try to smooth things over in Rome, and that was to provide his adversary with the recommendations of Florence's best painters. So, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Roselli all go to Rome to work for the Pope on this project. There are two sides to this where, while yes, they are in a way diplomatic gifts, they are also the recipients of the most prestigious commission of their careers. Once in Rome, likely the only decoration that was in the chapel would have been the vault, which was painted blue and inlaid with stars. So we have the vault of the heavens. This was eventually painted over by Michelangelo in his famous ceiling paintings. But for the work at hand now, however, we're in 1481. This group of artists would have needed to work together to harmonize their style and tell a consistent narrative according to the wishes of the Pope and the Commission. That means on one wall, along a horizontal band, we get scenes from the life of Christ, and on the other wall, scenes from the life of Moses, representing the key figures from both the Old and the New Testaments. Within this context, the Pope himself is seen as the third step in this story, as the vicar of Christ on earth, as the heir to both Moses and Christ. Now, some of their work was painted over by Michelangelo, so I only want to discuss what survives today, what can be seen today. And just as an aside, I find it so wild that we have what could be the best works of all of these masters, and folks tend to only look at Michelangelo's work when they visit the Sistine Chapel. I hope you'll be inspired to admire this lower register of paintings on your next visit. And instead of treating them in any kind of chronology, I want to talk artists. So let us start with Sandro Botticelli, who painted three of the large rectangular wall frescoes in the series. Two of these are from the life of Moses, known as the Temptations of Moses, the Punishments of Korah, and he did one fresco in the Life of Christ series, the Temptation of Christ. These are packed scenes where the many phases of these narratives are told simultaneously. In choosing just one to focus on, let us look at Botticelli's Punishment of Korah in the series of the Life of Moses in the Sistine Chapel.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, do you want more content and maybe to help support this show? Join me on Patreon for exclusive podcast episodes, or if you want a visual experience, you can enroll in my Udemy course, which teaches the Florentine Renaissance and includes nearly 12 hours of art history lectures. You can also find podcast merch on our Etsy. You'll find links to all of these in the show notes. I want to thank you all sincerely for listening. Now, back to the show. This scene is critically important to the message that Pope Sixtus IV wanted to convey. It shows the rebellion of the Israelites led by Korah against the leadership of both Moses and his brother Aaron. It reads right to left. So on the far right, the conspirators attempt to throw stones at Moses. This is their rebellion, their rising up, their dissatisfaction. And in the middle, we see Moses and Aaron run off the leader of the conspirators, Korah, and some of his followers. And then on the far left, the conspirators are swallowed by a chasm that opens in the earth, divine retribution for their rebellion against God and God's chosen leaders of the Israelites, particularly Moses. Botticelli, of course, having access to the Roman ruins all around him in the city, included not only the ruins of an ancient basilica on the right, but also centrally is certainly the triumphal arch of Emperor Constantine, which was and remains today right next to the Colosseum in the ancient center of the city. While there is an inscription on the real Arch of Constantine, Botticelli has replaced that inscription. So now it reads in Latin, but translated, "Let no man take the honor to himself except he that is called by God, as Aaron was." Let me translate that for you again in symbolic terms. Let no man challenge the authority of the Pope, who was chosen by God to rule, or, like the conspirators that you see in this painting, you too will perish in a deep chasm. Okay? Chasm. Why am I saying that weird? Chasm. Okay. Chasm. Also, in these scenes of Moses, I want to briefly point out the fresco completed by Luca Signorelli and Bartolomeo della Gatta, and that is the Death and Testament of Moses. And this is namely because it cannot be understated how influential the work of Luca Signorelli was on Michelangelo later, especially Signorelli's San Brizio Chapel that he did in Orvieto, but not until the 1500s. But this work, we see a similar pre-Michelangelo-esque, I'm talking about the Death and Testament of Moses, that pre-Michelangelo-esque, I don't think that's a word, but I like it, pre-Michelangelo-esque anatomy that comes to define what Michelangelo is going to do on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel later. So look closely if you can. We see Moses giving his testament. The famous Ark of the Covenant is at his feet, and his contemporaries, as well as Renaissance aristocrats mixed in with them, are listening attentively to Moses' sermon. Near the foreground, close to us, there's a mostly nude figure sitting, legs crossed, an anatomy that is very much in line with Signorelli's style and innovation of anatomical form. It is probably the only figure that actually is stylistically in line with the types of anatomies that Michelangelo would do later. The figure seems to twist in an unnatural, corkscrew way. Most of his body is exposed. It is the type of figure that Michelangelo makes as a mainstay of later 16th century Renaissance painting for everyone who follows him. We see the forerunner to that here in Signorelli's fresco. Have a good look at that. Should we turn now to the scenes from the life of Christ, which begins with the baptism by Sandro Botticelli and ends in the Last Supper by Cosimo Roselli? I want to talk about two scenes from the series of the life of Christ, starting with what is undoubtedly the Central Italian artist Pietro Perugino's masterpiece, if not the most impressive work of all of the early phase of painting in the Sistine Chapel, the delivery of the keys. If you have been listening regularly, you know I have no strong love for Perugino. However, in this context, in needing to work with other artists, in needing to harmonize style and narrative with especially these Florentine artists, This painting, The Delivery of the Keys, is quite honestly an exceptional work of art. We see right off the bat and immediately that harmony of space that Perugino is the master of, that he hands down to Raphael. We've talked about the two Marriage of the Virgin paintings by them, upon which The Delivery of the Keys owes a debt. We have a Renaissance style fictitious Eastern temple in the background with a dome, with registers of windows, Roman arches, Greek pediments, and a huge piazza in front of it, upon which all of the mastery of a perspectival grid, accurately rendered, is shown in the pavement of the floor. This grid creates a space in between Christ and St. Peter, Christ who gives the kneeled St. Peter the keys of the church. To the left and to the right are two triumphal arches, Roman style, ancient Roman style, just like we saw in Botticelli's Punishment of Korah. And all around, we have a wide variety and expression of figures and movements, even though they still have the flat emotionlessness that is standard of Perugino's style of painting. The space, the color, and the dynamism make up for it. There is something so expertly crafted about the harmonization of space, the relationship of figure groups, the perspectival grid, and the fictitious Renaissance architecture in the background, all of it designed to make you focus on the two central figures with these strong diagonal lines that lead you to Christ and St. Peter. Indeed, it is in this moment that Christ gives Peter the keys to the very church, which is the very symbol of the papacy itself. Meaning, in their coat of arms, you see the keys, the ones that Christ gave to St. Peter, the symbolic keys of the church. And if you recall, Peter is often called the rock of the church. Peter, Pietrus, which literally means rock. His name means rock. Okay. Peter, whose tomb St. Peter's Basilica is built upon, is considered the first in the genealogy of popes. And so, not only is this painting representative of the biblical episode itself, but it reinforces papal authority as the inheritors, as the legitimate Christ ordained authority of Christianity. I want to transition now to the unsung hero of the Sistine Chapel before we bring this all together, the underappreciated Last Supper painting by Cosimo Roselli, an artist who we have not discussed at any point yet on the podcast. Roselli is a late Quattrocento Florentine painter, and he was trained by Neri di Bicci, another artist we have not talked about, but who was active on the Florentine scene. Roselli is often regarded as the lesser talent among the masters of the Sistine Chapel, but I do want to propose that his Last Supper is anything but lesser, if not the supreme work of this phase of the decoration. It is likely he worked on this fresco alongside uh, his fellow artist, Biagio d'Antonio. Let's look at this work, which is opposite of Signorelli's painting of the death and testament of Moses, continuing the narrative parallels made between Moses and Christ and ultimately to the Pope. Because in this Last Supper, we are also given the crucifixion of Christ in a very clever narrative sequence. Let's unpack this. So the main sequence is the Last Supper, the Cenacolo, the moment in which two major biblical events take place. One, Christ performs what is considered the first Mass, where he tells his followers to drink the wine, to eat the bread as his body and blood. And we see the Eucharistic chalice in front of Christ to reinforce that. But also, the second important sequence here, and directly in front of Christ, is Judas Iscariot, the one who will betray Christ. And indeed, at the Last Supper, Christ announces that one of his apostles will betray him, Judas is the only one who sits on our side of the table. This is an earlier convention that we get as far back as the early 1400s at least, and a small demon sits on his shoulder, all things pointing to Judas as the betrayer of the Son of God. The rest of the story is cleverly told in three narrative images that appear to be frescoed onto the walls of the very dining hall in which this version of the Last Supper is taking place. So, narratives embedded inside of a narrative. The leftmost image of these three frescoes shows the agony in the garden, which occurs immediately after the Last Supper, where Christ is burdened with the weight of his impending doom and prays, asking for the strength that he needs to endure it. That human side of Christ. Then, directly above where Christ sits with Judas, or across from Judas, in the foreground, above him in another fictitious fresco, is the arrest of Christ, including the kiss of Judas, where Judas kisses Christ in order to notify the Roman soldiers who they need to arrest. And in the same scene, the wrath of St. Peter, who springs upon a Roman soldier and cuts off his ear. The arrest ultimately leads to the third panel, the climax of the Passion, Christ's crucifixion, mirrored on the opposite wall with the death of Moses. So the stories are all here, but so much of the admirable artistic mastery comes in the form of the composition of the work itself and that contribution to the narrative. We're about to get a little complicated. Get ready. Roselli has created an octagonal space in wonderful linear perspective. The shape of the table, which curves to mirror the octagon in the coffering of the ceiling above them, and a half octagonal wall behind Christ and the apostles, which bears those frescoes, reinforces the obviousness of the octagonal space. So, why is the octagon so important, and what does that have to do with the narrative sequence? The octagon itself is symbolic for its 8 sides. 8 is a sacred number in relation to what in Christian theology is known as the eighth day, the day that marks the end in the Old Testament of the cycle of creation, which was done in 7 days, and therefore it is symbolic of rebirth and resurrection. So, by evoking the number symbolism of the eighth day, the story Roselli tells us does not just end with the crucifixion, but extends all the way through to the resurrection of Christ and Christ's promise of resurrection and eternal life for those who follow him. It's pretty cool. And just to conclude on this work, I want to point out some of the marvelous little details. In the foreground, we see a cat and a dog having a bit of a standoff. Some of you from the American continents might see a possum. That dog looks like a possum. It's not a possum. No possums here in Italy at the time, and none now. But I don't think that 1481 they wouldn't have known what one was. And to the very far left, this is important, we see a more modernly dressed courtly figure dressed in gold and purple. This is a very beautiful type of tangentismo, the use of contrast colors to create light and shade, as opposed to a shaded variant of the same color. Not only is purple a complicated color in itself to make and to produce, but what we see on this figure on the very far left is real gilding in gold that makes him shimmer when you look at him. So, when you see this fresco in person, there is movement in the image according to the light and according to how you move through space. but also a very attractive mix and color system that is purple with gold that immediately makes you look at this figure, even though he is not manipulated within this octagonal perspectival system. So he then is in turn staring across the fresco diagonally into the fictional space at the scene of the crucifixion. It is the use of an undeniably captivating color system that directs you across the narrative of the fresco through this leftmost figure and the absolute divine application of pigment and color to his attire. Renaissance people, in the early phase of the Sistine Chapel, we see all of the best masters converge on Rome and tackle a theologically complex fresco cycle befitting of the holiest seat in Western Christianity. In this brief conversation, we talked about Sandro Botticelli, we talked about Pietro Perugino, Cosimo Roselli, we talked about Luca Signorelli. Theologically complex, but also affirming in the inheritance of the popes as the protectors and the continuers of the Christian faith, where Rome now serves as the New Jerusalem in the power of the Pope as the supreme power of the Christian world. That's what's being asserted here. In addition to these frescoes, the register above these narratives, the same masters painted the portraits of historical popes, continuing to always reinforce that hereditary or lineage and succession based ideologies of the papacy rooted in medieval history, which starts with Christ and St. Peter themselves. Perugino will also paint the wall behind the altar, but that was painted over by Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Renaissance people, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Of course, there is a lot more work to be done on this chapel, but now we have a clear sense of what was the state of it when Michelangelo came to Rome to paint the ceiling, which we will discuss in the next episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and until next time, arrivederci.